Hey guys. Chapter 25, Rock, Root, and Rage. Land of Stories. Here we go. The golden arches and pillars of the fairy palace could barely contain the anxieties growing inside of them. The 7 colorful fairies of the fairy council paced around the main hall, away from the respected podiums, desperately trying to come up with an overdue solution to the crisis at hand. The whole territory has been destroyed, Xanthos said. The flames on his head and shoulders were flickering wildly. We need to find her. Every corner of every kingdom has been searched twice, and there's still no trace of her, says Esmeralda. Emeralda, not Esmeralda. But what could we do if we found her? Skylene asked. We are no match for the Enchantress. Our magic is useless against hers, Rosa added, and she grows more powerful every day. But we must do something, anything, Xanthos demanded. The world is counting on us. Tangerina has grown tired of his complaining. Even her bees were irritated and flew around her beehive with their stingers out. Then why don't you think of something to do, she said. We've all been in here for days trying to come up with a practical solution. It's not like we're keeping anything from you. Well, if we can't come up with a practical solution, then I suggest we come up with an impractical solution, Xanthos half-heartedly suggested. Let's fight her at her own game. Who cares about honoring our very values? The flames on Xanthos' shoulders flickered faster as he thought about it. The world has always looked to us to handle its problems with peace and understanding. We cannot abandon these morals now. That's what the Enchantress wants, Esmeralda said. You can't extinguish a fire by adding more flames. You of all people should know that, Xanthos. Then, if we can't use our magic to stop her, let's gather all the witches and warlocks from the Dwarf Forest and Pinocchio Prison and have them defeat her, he proposed. Esmeralda massaged her forehead. You want to set loose the witches and warlocks that we imprisoned? She asked him. Xanthos' flames diminished. He slumped. She didn't have to elaborate for him to realize how bad of an idea that was. Any more bright ideas? Tangerina asked him. Xanthos turned to respond to her, but he had nothing to say. They were at a dead end. What if we can't come up with an answer? Coral had asked in a tiny voice, cuddling her pet walking fish. Will all of us just perish if we can't stop her? The situation had finally reached a point that forced them to consider the consequences of failing. Esmeralda's eyes eyed her fellow fairies, angered by the sudden hopelessness. Shame on all of you, Esmeralda said, and walked around the room. She stared directly into each of their eyes as she passed them. We are the Fairy Council. And if we lose our hope, all hope for the rest of the world is as good as gone. As long as someone remains standing with a noble heart, there will always be a good way for good to triumph over evil. The other fairies looked around at one another, inspired by Esmeralda's words. Moments like these were the reasons why Esmeralda was the head of the Fairy Council. A small magenta flame abruptly appeared on the floor of the main hall. It was out of thin air and didn't appear to be burning anything but the air around it. Esmeralda gazed at it and cautiously stepped away. Brace yourselves, she said, as her green eyes grew large. We're about to have company. With a giant blast, the purple flame rapidly grew into a roaring magenta fire that covered the majority of the room. The fairies screamed and shielded themselves from the blaze. A split second later, the flames vanished and the Enchantress appeared. The fairies froze with fear. Esmea always knew how to make an entrance. Ah, it's good to be home, Esmea laughed and looked around the room at all the frightened faces of her old peers. For people who thought I was dead, you never look happy to see me. Esmeralda was the only fairy brave enough to address her. Why have you come here, Esmea? The Enchantress ignored the question. Oh, look, Esmea said happily. She strutted to the forgotten golden chair that had been pushed to the side of the room. It's my old seat from when I was on the Fairy Council. Remember those days? You've certainly shown your true colors since, Esmeralda said. You act as if you're all faultless, Esmea sneered. I can see right through the pathetic facade of such a perfect, loving family. I know how spiteful you can be when no one is looking. I sat in this room for hours every day trying to make the world a better place just as much as the rest of you. But why do you target me with your cruelty? Why was I treated so poorly by the people who were supposed to be perfect? because you became vindictive, Esmeralda said. No, Esmea said and shook her head. It was because I became better. I was more powerful, more gifted, and more liked than any of you could ever be. When the fairy godmother announced me as her heir, you acted as if I had done something horrible to you. She put me on a pedestal, and you all isolated me there. As your ability grew, so did your ego, Esmeralda said. You thought you were above us. You even renounced your title as fairy. You're the ones who renounced me long before I ever did, Esmea said and glared at her. You ignored me, excluded me, and hated me from the moment I arrived. The world may be convinced that you have nothing to do with my change of career, but I will always know the truth. You made it impossible for me to be anything but disdained. The enchantress ran a finger on the arm of her old chair, remembering all the painful memories of her time as a fairy. The cruelest thing you could do to someone is force them to hurt alone. And you left me hurting on my own many times, Esmea said. Every time I was heartbroken, I would go to the rest of you hoping to receive some compassion, but you let your jealousies get in the way of showing any sympathy. You actually enjoyed watching me suffer, relishing in the fact that something was distressing me. Esmeralda surprised the enchantress and the other fairies with what she said next. She didn't deny it. I admit even we were all guilty of being a little less than perfect at times, Esmeralda said. But we've all grown from this mistake, from your mistake. Your mistakes have only grown. Esmea snorted and slowly clapped in Esmeralda's direction. Touché, the enchantress said. You managed to admit you were wrong and scold me in one breath? You're good at this leadership thing, Em. No wonder they replaced me with you. I am not a replacement. You were never what the council needed. No, I was never what the council wanted, Esmea said sharply. They chose you, Esmeralda, because you were more beautiful, and the world always listened to a pretty face over an average one. And even though I changed my appearance and gained beauty over time, they still chose you over me, because you are easier to control. Ooh, snap. You were the fairy godmother's puppet that I could never be. Esmeralda returned to her scornful state. I'd rather be a toy than a tyrant, Esmea, she said. But I am assuming that you didn't come here to reminisce, so it brings you to our kingdom. A small grin appeared on the enchantress's face. She was delighted to get a rise out of the fairy. The truth is, I've become rather bored waiting for you and the other rulers to gradually hand their kingdoms over to me, Esmea said, sitting in her old chair. I've decided to invite them all to a new home that I'm building for myself and get it all over with. I'm anxious for the whole thing to conclude, as much as you all are. None of us are going anywhere with you, Xanthos said, and his flames rose. A cunning smirk grew on the enchantress's face. Oh, yes, you are, Esmea said. It's not an option. The enchantress snapped her fingers, and the ground started to rumble with the power of a dozen earthquakes. All the fairies looked at one another, petrified of what was coming their way. Clusters of vines exploded out of the floor and seized the fairies in the room. They desperately tried to free themselves, struggling against the plants with all of their might and all of their magic, but it was no use. The plants were too strong to escape. Esmea roared with laughter as she watched the vines coil around each fairy council member and drag them into the ground. Esmeralda sank her hands into the ground to prevent the vines from dragging her away. You won't win, Esmea, she had said. Oh, but I will, the enchantress said, looking down at her with a smile in her eyes. You see, I'm finally building my own pedestal, but this time, rather than admiration, I'm building it from rock, root, and rage. Things were gloomy as ever at the charming palace. All the other rulers had gone home from the happily ever after assembly meeting, except for Sleeping Beauty, who had no choice but to stay. She sat with Cinderella in her chambers, quietly comforting the distraught mother. It's been almost 2 weeks since that horrible woman took my daughter away from me, Cinderella said. I never thought I could feel like this inside. I never thought I could be so miserable. Sleeping Beauty dabbed the tears spilling from her friend's tired eyes. You have to stay strong, Cinderella, Sleeping Beauty said. We have to be brave for our people. Cinderella blew her nose into a handkerchief. But who is supposed to be brave for us at a time like this? She asked. When the rest of the world is looking for us for strength and guidance, what do we do to look up for reassurance? Sleeping Beauty gently took Cinderella's hand in her own. We have to inspire each other, she said. Cinderella patted her friend's hand and placed her head on Sleeping Beauty's shoulder. There was a knock at the door. Come in, Cinderella said. Sir Lambton had stepped into the Queen's chambers. His face was so long the Queen knew he wasn't bearing any good news. What is it, Sir Lambton? Cinderella said, bracing herself for what it was. More bad news, I'm afraid, Your Majesty, he said. I just received a letter from Sir Grant in the Northern Kingdom. Apparently, the Enchantress attacked the Northern Kingdom last night after attacking Troll and Goblin territory. They woke up this morning to discover all their crops had been poisoned. Goodness gracious, Sleeping Beauty said and placed a hand on her chest. Does the Enchantress even have a soul? Queen Snow White has asked that we send what we can. Yes, of course, Cinderella said. Gather as much food as the kingdom can spare. The ground under the palace began to shake. Cinderella's chambers rattled as something moved through the palace toward the chamber. Hold on.